Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for this video. Today we're going to be talking about pre-emergence. So to start off with, I know that this video could get a little bit lengthy because I have a lot of stuff to cover as far as information goes. So I'm going to put some timestamps down in the description below. If you'd like to skip ahead to a couple different sections or whatever you're interested in, just check out the description and you can click those little links and it'll take you right to that part of the video. So what is a pre-emergent? Well, essentially when we're talking about pre-emergence, most people are going to probably be thinking of crabgrass prevention. And there's a couple other weeds that it controls as well. So if you look at the label here of one of the popular pre-emergents that you can use, you'll see that there are some other grasses and weeds that it controls. But mainly people are going to be talking about crabgrass prevention. And what this chemical does is essentially just creates a barrier in the soil so that when those weeds try to germinate, it doesn't allow this to happen and they cannot emerge out of the soil. Also, a little later on, we'll be talking about one type of pre-emergent that does also kill crabgrass and things after it has emerged, and it's in the very early stages. So there are technically some things that do post-emergence control as well, but we're mainly talking about pre-emergence here for crabgrass. Someone recently asked me as well about dandelion control and if there's a pre-emergent for that, and I believe that there is. I would have to do a little more research on exactly what product that is. Essentially with dandelions, it can usually be controlled fairly well, even with something like Weed Be Gone that you could pick up at a big box store, or something just general broadleaf control. Also, this would be an area where some people put down weed and feed or a type of product like that, because in terms of what that's going to control, it's more targeting the broadleaf weeds, and we're not looking at things like crabgrass and other weeds like that. So those weed and feeds are more looking at dandelion control and broadleaf weeds that might be in your yard. However, I think there's a little bit better way of controlling those, and I still think that spraying or spot spraying those is probably a better option than just the weed and feed because it doesn't target the weed specifically. Alright, so is a pre-emergent really necessary is something that I've wanted to talk about on my channel for a little while now. I just didn't really have the exact video to do that, but I think that is this video today. So when we moved into our house, we had pretty much a yard like most people have when they're starting out. It hadn't really been fertilized, not a lot of weed control, nobody was really taking care of it. So I started out with kind of what most people start out with, and I had to come up with a plan as to how I was going to improve the yard. So I think in a case of that, when you're looking at pre-emergents, I think this is a good idea to use them. And the reason is that you're going to get a head start on trying to control some of those weeds, and crabgrass and foxtail and things like that. They can be pretty invasive if you're trying to spray them after the fact, after they really mature and grow up during the season. So that would be a good place to start if you are dealing with a yard that you really haven't had any fertilizers or really any care for it for the last couple years. However, for my yard, once I started to really take care of things, I kind of was thinking to myself, do I really need to use all these pre-emergents? And I kind of experimented the last couple years without using anything. So in the backyard, I haven't been using anything. Front yard, haven't been using anything for the last 2 to 3 seasons, I believe. And my grass is really super thick. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that that's kind of been the main focus, is kind of building up the soil, getting the grass to a thickness where it's going to shade out and going to outcompete all these weeds anyway. So because of that, when it comes to pre-emergence, I think you need to look at your lawn history, like I said, whether you've been in your yard a long time and working on it or whether it's brand new. And then also look at your neighborhood and see what kind of problems your neighbors are having. Do you have a lot of crabgrass around the neighborhood, a lot of weeds, things like that? If you're dealing with a lot of that in your area and you also haven't really been working on your yard for very long, all these factors might sway your decision a little bit more towards using a pre-emergent, at least until you get your yard up to the place that you want it to be. And even beyond, a lot of people with a really nice yard also use pre-emergents. They just don't want to deal with any weeds. They want to prevent everything possible. And that's okay too. Just for me, I've been experimenting a little bit because I just don't like to blanket things with chemicals if I don't really need to. So what I've been finding in my yard over the past couple seasons is I really haven't had much problem with weeds at all. I've grown the yard to a thickness where it outcompetes pretty much everything else, even though a lot of the neighbors around me, and if you've seen any of my videos, you know my neighborhood is definitely not low on weed pressure. So there's a lot of weeds and things around my neighborhood, but to be honest, most of them are more of a broadleaf type anyway, so what I'm dealing with there is dandelions and things like that. These pre-emergents are not going to prevent that anyway. So my theory in general is that if you have a thin yard or maybe have some bare spots in your yard, what would be more beneficial for you is to just work on thickening the grass. So put down some more seed, fix those bare spots with some more seed and keep it watered. Do the proper fertilization, do all those things in your yard that's going to get the thickness of the grass to the point where it's going to outcompete the weeds anyway. That's just kind of my theory and what has been working for me. It's not to say that I'll never use a pre-emergent again, or that maybe it's going to be necessary for me at some point. Just for me, I haven't personally seen the need to continue to use them very much. So another factor for my yard is that my wife does some organic gardening. I use the clippings from my backyard every once in a while, every couple cuts maybe, whenever she needs some clippings to put into her garden. So when I was using pre-emergents in the backyard, we did a little test and I just took one little plant in her garden, put some of those clippings around it to see if it would kind of hinder the growth of that. And definitely the test that I did showed that it didn't help the garden very much, and the plant that I was experimenting with didn't look as good as the rest of the garden. And because she's trying to do all organic in there, I just try to keep the chemicals out of the grass clippings as well. So that's another reason for me to not use pre-emergents as much in my yard. It's not saying that you can't do it, not saying that I'm totally against it in any way. I just kind of wanted to share my thoughts on that. Another thing about talking about those pre-emergents and whether they're necessary is one thing you have to remember is that if you're going to be doing any seeding of any kind in the spring or in the fall and you're going to be using pre-emergents, then these two don't go together. So it's not going to let the seed grow for the most part, and you're kind of wasting seed and money at that point. So you want to keep this in mind. Just remember that if you're going to be doing any seeding, you're going to be doing overseeding, then you cannot be using pre-emergents with those. And this is a factor for me as well because I tend to like to do a lot of overseeding and things. So that's another reason why I haven't been using pre-emergents. So another factor that a lot of people don't talk about when it comes to pre-emergents is the fact that they are a root inhibitor. And what this means is that basically they're going to do just a little bit of damage to the grass root system as well. So just keep that in mind if you just did some overseeding maybe in the fall and it's now the spring and you don't have a super mature grass plant there yet. Just keep that in mind as something to think about in terms of pre-emergents and whether you want to use them. And finally, I think people freak out maybe just a little bit too much in terms of finding a weed here or there in their yard and trying to massively prevent this. If you find one here or there, it's not really that big of a deal. Number one, if it's a single one just here or there in your yard, you can pull it out by hand. Or if you're doing some spot spraying, if you have just a few more here and there, again, that works too. It's not really that big of a deal. So just keep that in mind. If you find a few weeds here and there, it's perfectly normal. Nothing that's going to end the world, and certainly not going to end your lawn. Alright, so what are the options if you want to use a pre-emergent? So a very important factor here when it comes to talking about pre-emergents is our soil temperature. So if you're in the south right now, I'm sure you're well above this, but crabgrass pretty much germinates around 55 degrees. And because of the spring that we've had up north or even in the northeast, we're actually quite a bit behind our normal schedule, so you're probably okay as far as soil temperature goes. I made a video on that as well, showing you an option on how you can test your soil temperature fairly cheaply with just a regular little thermometer. So check that out if you're interested. But right now you could also just go off of some of the plants in the area. So typically, again, the forsythia bush is a good one to go off of, or some of the trees in your area. Those are pretty much natural signs of what the soil is doing as far as temperature goes. So before 55 is what we're aiming for if we're going to be using a certain chemical like Barricade. But if you're past that window and you don't see a lot of crabgrass coming up yet, except maybe in the early stages, we still do have an option for that, and that would be Dimension. First off, these options for chemicals do exist at the big box store, so if you want to find something, you could go to a Lowe's, a Home Depot. Here in the Midwest, there's a lot of Menards stores. Those options do exist there, and they're probably more budget friendly than what I'm going to recommend after this. However, the difference is that most of the time these are mixed with fertilizer. So this gets back to a few thoughts that I shared on my when to start fertilizing video, which I will link here. But depending on how long you've been taking care of your yard, if you started fertilizing last fall, then you may not want to throw a bunch of nitrogen on in the early spring. So if you haven't done anything to your yard last fall, if you didn't put down any nitrogen, you're just getting started now, then you're probably pretty nitrogen deficient anyway, and I think you'd be okay with a fertilizer like that that has some crabgrass preventer in it if you would like to go that route. If you have been fertilizing, your yard's in good shape, you've been doing all the things you need to do over the years, then you probably don't need a nitrogen fertilizer at the really early spring, and the reason for this is that it's just going to cause a lot of flush of growth. And if you want to know a few more thoughts about that, again, check out my video on when to start fertilizing in the yard. That's really the only reason why you wouldn't want to use one of these budget options as far as something from a big box store, is that it's very hard to find your crabgrass preventer without the fertilizer mixed in. But you can see that it's exactly the same chemical that you're using, Dithiopyr, and this is going to be the same exact thing that you can buy if you're buying the Pre-Emergent as a standalone version. So same chemical here, it does exist at the big box stores. Just keep in mind that if you're going to use those, it's probably going to include a fertilizer, and you need to think about that a little bit. Another option in the budget version would be looking at like a fertilizer distributor in your area, maybe a co-op, or just look in your area, search for a fertilizer distributor or a turf grass product distributor in your area and see what you have. Sometimes these people have the Pre-Emergents available standalone and at a fairly budget option for you, so check that out. So what options do we have when we're talking about the standalone products? And these are usually the more expensive options. So the typical chemicals that we're going to use are going to be a couple things. One would be Barricade, which is also called prodiamine, or that's the chemical that's used. And two would be Dimension, which is also a chemical named Dithiopyr. So these are probably the most popular ones, and they're just going to be a little bit more expensive if you buy them in the standalone version. Now there's some granular options if you'd like to spread them. There's also some spray options if you would prefer to spray it on your yard and mix it in a tank and do all that. So those are the chemical names, and those are what we're going to be talking about. You can also find these locally from time to time from those stores that I mentioned, but a lot of times if you're looking specifically for the Pre-Emergent, you're either going to have to go to some kind of turf grass distributor like I mentioned, something you can find close to you, or you might have to order these online. Okay, so let's look at my little whiteboard here. I certainly do not have the best handwriting in the world, but I did my best. So let's look first at the left side, and that is at Barricade and prodiamine. So this is a really good chemical option, but one of the main factors that you have to think about is that it only works before the crabgrass is germinated. So this is important to remember, because if you're already past that point, you have a few crabgrass plants growing in your yard, they're in the early stages. If you put this down, it's not going to do anything for that. So that's one thing you need to remember. If you can test your soil temperature, this would be a very good option for you because it lasts quite a while. It lasts a little bit longer than Dimension typically, and it's just going to work well as long as you don't have any plants emerging already. So let's go to the other side with Dimension. The nice thing about this chemical is that if you're already past the 55-degree window and there's some plants growing, if they're in the early stages, this has some post-emergent capabilities to it as well, which means that it's going to kill those plants in their early stages. Now, if you're way beyond this and things are growing out of control already, then really you're past the pre-emergent and post-emergent part of these chemicals, and you're kind of looking at spraying at that point with something like quinclorac. The thing about Dimension is that it also doesn't last quite as long as the prodiamine would, so you might need 2 apps of this if you decide to go with this chemical. You could also mix the two. You could start with a lower app of prodiamine that might last 2 to 3 months at the early spring. Then you could go with something like Dimension later on in the early summertime to kind of catch anything that might have come up, and this is going to take care of those post-emergents as we talked about. The other thing about Dimension is it's just a little bit more expensive typically, so that's one thing to think about. But again, if you're looking at those budget options that we talked about and you find something with Dimension in it, then it might be a little bit cheaper this way. Just know that, again, it has fertilizer mixed in. So as far as rates go, a lot of people are going to be asking, what rate do I put this down at? And because there's so many grass types, depending on where you live, you have warm season, cool season. So I can't give you an exact rate there as far as what you should use for your yard, but have no fear. The label is going to be your friend here, and it's going to tell you what to use. So it's going to tell you what rate you should be putting down, and it's also going to tell you a max rate for the year. This is going to help you kind of gauge how much you want to put down and how long that's going to last. So also, if you're probably into lawn care, you've probably seen the Lawn Care Nuts videos. So I highly recommend checking out the Lawn Care Nuts Pre-Emergent guide. He has some thoughts on mixing the two, the Barricade and Dimension, in kind of a system there, and also some rates for warm season and cool season if you're going to go with a system that he recommends. So I would recommend checking that out. It's something that you can think about. Also, just check out the product label and follow those. Make sure you don't go over the max rates. So if you're interested in these products, either Barricade or Dimension, and you want to look at some options, I do have some links in the description to some things that you can buy online on Amazon. So those would be some options for you to purchase online if you're looking to do that. So check those out in the description below. The other important factor with any of these pre-emergents is that they need to be watered in, and it recommends at least a ½ inch of water. This is going to put it down into the soil and create that barrier. So this is probably one of the most important factors, is to make sure that this gets watered in. So finally, another question that people might have is, what if you're using a pre-emergent but maybe didn't get the timing correct, or it just didn't work as well as you thought it was going to, you have a few weeds here and there. What are some of the options to control those things? So mainly just remember that a lot of the weeds that you're dealing with in your lawn are going to be broadleaf. Now yes, if you have a big crabgrass problem or foxtail or something similar, then these pre-emergents are important for those things. And even if you have some of these things pop up after you use your pre-emergent, there are ways of getting rid of them. But also keep in mind that you might be seeing a lot of other weeds in your yard, clover, dandelions, things like that. These are not going to be controlled by these pre-emergents anyway, so you need to deal with those in a different way. And I would just suggest, first off, checking out something like a Weed B Gone product from your Home Depot, Lowe's, all those stores. I've had pretty good luck with those. The thing that you want to do is try to mix it with a surfactant. So what this is going to do is just coat the leaves of the broadleaf weed a little bit better, and it helps so that you have better results. That would be one thing that will help you with those Weed B Gone type products. So for crabgrass, if you didn't use a pre-emergent or you had some weeds that still came up, you can use a Weed B Gone with crabgrass control. And I have used this in the past. It does work to some extent, but if you look at the label here, you're going to see that what's mixed in as far as the chemical for crabgrass control, the quinclorac, that's going to be pretty low mixed in here, and therefore this isn't the greatest option. But if you just wanted to pick some up, or say you already had some on the shelf for some of your broadleaf weeds, then it'd be definitely something to try and mix in with the surfactant as well. So if you didn't put down a pre-emergent, or you have a lot of problems with crabgrass, then there's another option, and this is a chemical called quinclorac. I hope I'm saying that right, but essentially this is going to be an option for after the crabgrass has come up, it's mature, and you want to spray it and try to get rid of it. So that would be the option there. That can be purchased on its own and has a lot better strength when you do it that way. So you should have better results than just using something like a Weed B Gone that wasn't specifically targeted for the crabgrass. So I hope that covers some of your questions. I tried to get all the thoughts out that I could as far as touching on different reasons why I don't use pre-emergents anymore, really, why you might still want to, and kind of the pros and cons on the different chemicals and things like that. But if you do have questions, please leave them in the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching this video. We'll see you next time.